I'm Victor Benassi. I'm the faculty director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. And our center every year has the pleasure and honor to sponsor this annual event to recognize teaching excellence and student learning at UNH. And this is another great opportunity to do that. What I will do is just acknowledge we have maybe 10 or 12 former Brierley recipients here. And I think I have you all. So we have Chris Bauer, and I know he's over there somewhere. And as the Academy says, hold your applause. All right. Wally Bothner is right over there. Oh, stop it. Nancy Kinner, I know she's here. There she is. She told me not to acknowledge her. But David Hebert, right back there. Ron Croce, who I believe is right over there. And P.T. Vasudevan, right there. And Don Hadwin, who I believe is right there. And Ray Cook, who I saw right there. And Windsor Hayes Watson III, right over there. And Barry Fussell, who I believe is right over there. So let's... and Gail, see, this is, I saw you were checked on my list, and Gail Carey, who's sitting right there. Now, anybody else? I hope you can. All right, I'm going to turn it over to President Huddleston to welcome.
Well, thank you, Victor, and I am delighted to add my welcome to the group. This is an auspicious year. This is the 25th annual award of the Brierley Award, and it's always nice to celebrate things with round numbers like that. We're coming up on our 150th anniversary. We'll all be doing a lot of celebrating for the next year, but this is a really special occasion in a lot of respects. As I think about UNH in the landscape of public flagship universities around the country, I know that we're all proud of the wonderful research that happens on this campus and what happens in our studios and all the great writing that our humanists do. But I think what really makes us distinctive in that landscape is the extraordinary commitment to teaching that this institution has always demonstrated, despite the wonderful research that goes on here. And that really does make us distinctive. There aren't many places of our size and our character that take teaching as seriously as we do, that has a faculty as committed as you are to excellent teaching. And there is no doubt in my mind that it is that kind of seriousness and commitment which has led to the kind of long-term results that we see out of UNH. You probably have all heard the results of the Gallup survey that we publicized last year that tracked our alumni over decades. And we lead almost every other university in America on all the major indicators of life satisfaction, and it all tracks back, I think, to the kind of commitment that you all demonstrate day in and day out to excellent teaching. So I'm proud to be part of this community for a lot of reasons, but that clearly is one of them. So today we honor really two people. We honor Jean Brierley again for her thoughtfulness in endowing this award in the first place. Jean Brierley was a 1930 graduate of the University of New Hampshire who went on to a long and distinguished career as a biologist at Michigan State University and had the foresight to create an endowment in the 1970s for this award. And we're very happy continually to honor her. But we also are honoring a particular individual who's receiving that award today, Sarah Sherman. It seems like every time I come into this room, I'm honoring and congratulating Sarah for winning something. And I'm happy to do it again today. And to tell us more about Sarah, I would invite her chair, Rachel Trubowitz, to come up and talk a bit more. Rachel?
Welcome, everyone, and it is a profound honor for me to introduce Sarah Sherman for this wonderful award that she's winning today. I know that Mark had mentioned something about how UNH, we are leaders in both scholarship and in teaching, and this is a teaching occasion, but I didn't want to forget that, or have you forget that Sarah is also an outstanding scholar. She is a specialist on 19th and 20th century American literature. She is the author of 2 monographs, Sarah Orne Jewett, An American Persephone, and more recently, Sacramental Shopping, Louisa May Alcott, Edith Wharton, and the Spirit of Modern Consumerism. She also has published a wide variety of scholarly articles, book chapters, and reviews. In 1997, she produced a scholarly edition of Sarah Orne Jewett, The Country of Pointed Firs and Other Stories, and she wrote the introduction to that volume. In Sacramental Shopping, Professor Sherman takes her interest in 19th century American women writers in a new direction from the one that she took in her first book. She sets aside the literary categories traditionally associated with Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, which is the juvenile category, and Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth, realist fiction, to argue that these 2 canonical texts are structurally bound together by the complexities of an ascending and accelerating consumer culture. Sarah's scholarship in Sacramental Shopping has received the highest praise, most recently in a book review published in the December 2015 issue of American Literature, the top journal in Sarah's field. This is what the reviewer writes, and it is high praise indeed. Sarah, she doesn't call her Sarah. Professor Sherman's meticulous, granular exegesis of both novels is illuminating at every point. Those skeptical of the value of close reading are advised to consult Sherman for thick interpretation at its literary, anthropological, and historical best. And as we turn to the topic of Sarah's talk today, which is the teacher is present, you can see that the scholar is also present in Sarah's work. Obviously, as a teacher, Sarah's accomplishments are unsurpassed. After more than 3 decades in the classroom, Professor Sherman retains the keenest interest in honing her skills and finding new techniques and methods for providing each of her students with an optimal learning experience. And I would like to quote another member of the English department faculty who wrote something quite wonderful about Sarah, and that is who he is. That is Professor Tom Newkirk, who is himself, I believe, a recipient of the Lindbergh Award, but not the Brierley Award, but the Lindbergh Award, equally prestigious. And he, I think, has captured Sarah's essence better than I can. He writes, "Sarah is fully present. It is never a matter of ego or personal bias or preferred interpretation. She is there for the student or for the department or for the college or for the University Press of New England where she served as editor. It's never about her. This quality has made her so very trusted in our department and so valued as a colleague. It has made her a sought-after advisor. This form of attentiveness is characteristic of all her work, and has been since she joined our faculty more than 3 decades ago. It is this characteristic attentiveness that is the subject of Sarah's lecture today. We are fortunate indeed that Professor Sherman has spent her career at UNH gracing our classrooms and enhancing the intellectual life and scholarly excellence of our university. Please welcome Professor Sarah Sherman to the podium.
Dear. I want to thank President Huddleston for his welcome, and thanks to Rachel. That was kind of overwhelming. Really, it's amazing. And thanks also to you all for coming. It's wonderful to see everyone here, especially my family, my husband Jamie Calderwood, my sister Carrie Sherman, my brother-in-law Terry Whiting. I want to express my gratitude to all those who wrote in support of my nomination for this award, and to the Brierley Award Committee for selecting me and for giving me this opportunity to reflect on my own teaching. Thanks also to Lisa McFarlane, our former UNH provost, for approving that selection, as well as to Victor Benassi, Catherine Overson, and the Center for Teaching Excellence for arranging this gathering today. And I want to include Provost Vasudevan for that as well. I also want to express my gratitude to Lester Fisher and John Ernest, my former English department colleagues and prior recipients of the Brierley Award, for the fine example they set for me. And knowing how many dedicated and inspiring teachers we have at UNH, and how many we have right in this room, I see myself honored today as their representative, as someone who shares their work and values, and I hope my talk today speaks to that work and those values. It's dedicated to my parents, my first teachers. When I learned that I'd received the Brierley Award, along with feeling both thrilled and humbled, I felt thoroughly daunted by its requirement that I give this talk. When I confessed my anxiety to Tom Newkirk, my English department colleague, from whom I've learned so much about teaching over the years, he encouraged me to turn to my own practice as a teacher. He recalled interviewing me for his book, Slow Reading, and asking me what I wanted students to learn in my classes. He had expected me to give him a list of things like how to scan a poem, how to research the historical background of a novel, and so on. And I do believe that all those skills are important. But what he remembers me saying is, I want my students to learn how to pay attention. I had frankly forgotten saying this, but when I heard Tom quote me, I thought, yeah, that's right, that's what I want. Like Henry James, one of my favorite authors, I would advise young readers and writers, try to be one on whom nothing is lost. And yet I also know that taking in too much information can be overwhelming and disorienting, making learning more rather than less difficult. However, I believe that in addition to learning how to open your attention wide to the world, you can learn a complementary skill, how to tighten that aperture and sharpen your focus with great intensity. And this rhythm of opening, then narrowing, widening, then focusing attention seems a key to my practice as a teacher. All that by way of explaining the title of my talk today, The Teacher is Present, a variation on the title of Marina Abramovic's performance piece, The Artist is Present. In that piece, which she performed in 2010 for over 736 hours at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Abramovic sat in a chair in the center of the MoMA atrium, where individual museum goers were invited to sit opposite her for up to 5 minutes at a time. She then simply met the gaze of each visitor without speaking, but with great empathy and intensity of attention. Those who participated later described the experience as deeply affecting. Just as Marcel Duchamp revolutionized modern understanding of what constitutes art by designated ready-made everyday objects as art, thereby locating artistic value not in the object, but in the way the object was seen, Abramovic reduced the artist's relationship to her audience to a moment of pure, mindful attention, an essential connection unmediated by any object at all. Attention itself was the focus of her performance. And yet, as powerful as I find Abramovic's insight, when I thought of it in relation to my own pedagogical practice, I couldn't help but recall the essay question from my 1966 SAT English subject exam. Can you be so open-minded that your brains fall out? Discuss. And that really was the question. I mean, you just can't forget that. In other words, teaching, it seems to me, demands both mindful, open attention and focused, purposeful direction. And it is bringing those dual aspects of the task into fruitful alignment that is key. Henry James also understood this balance when he noticed that once a writer has opened up to the world, they need to find their donné, a starting point in all that welter of information that engages them. the initial subject from which their novel will grow. Sarah Orne Jewett called it, quote, the thing that teases the mind and at last gets itself put down rightly on paper. And once the writer has that donné, they need to find the form to contain and shape its development. One of my favorite quotations about writing also comes from Henry James, from his preface to the novel Roderick Hudson. Quote, really, universally, relations stop nowhere, and the exquisite problem of the artist is eternally but to draw, by a geometry of his own, the circle within which they shall happily appear to do so. As teachers, we are, like novelists, all too aware that relations end nowhere. I know that I could drone on, expounding on shapeless expanses of information, long past the point where my students have lost even the semblance of any interest they might have had. And I confess that sometimes that's just what I've done. Again, the trick is to be aware of those beckoning expanses and yet be able to resist them, to draw the boundaries so firmly that a compelling and engaging pattern of meaning emerges just before the class hour ends. As a teacher, then, I see myself located at the intersection between my students and the texts of a literary tradition. To teach my students how to pay attention to those texts, I must open my attention both to the tradition and to them. But I must also focus that attention to provide a structure within which meaning can emerge, both for myself and for my students. So for my talk today, I'd like to explore this dance between mindful openness and directed focus, first in my relationship to the literary tradition I teach, then in my preparation and strategies for teaching those texts in the classroom, and finally in my work with individual students to help them discover and develop their own ideas in response to my teaching. So this is the first part. To return to the moment when I first heard that I would be asked to prepare this talk, I was, as I've admitted, dismayed. I drew a total blank. But then I read Nancy Kinner's excellent Brierley talk online and was heartened by her admission that she felt the same way. Suddenly, where there was nothing to say, there was too much to say. Ideas came flooding into my mind. Snippets of texts and comments from colleagues and family and former teachers swam into view, like phrases on the black fortune-telling 8-ball, the child's toy to which my sister and I would address questions and watch as some gnomic phrase appeared in a murky window. I thought of how in Greek mythology, the goddess memory is the mother of the muses. Then I thought of Google and how Google is now almost like an artificial, omniscient mind of God. But then, oddly, I thought not of Google being like human memory, but of my memory being like Google. How is this vast, instant, artificial memory affecting how we see ourselves and our own capacities? How strange, how interesting. And now that this flood of information is upon us, how do we make sense of it? The sociologist Barry Schwartz has described a, quote, paradox of choice. Too many choices, he finds, result in an inability to make choices at all, a kind of paralysis of the focusing, decision-making ability. The paradox of choice is perhaps even more paralyzing now as choices multiply and press themselves upon our attention. I think of Michael Ferber's recent Lindbergh lecture on the virtual impossibility of keeping up with today's massive accumulation of scholarship. However, here I have to remind myself of how remembering and forgetting are in a constant dialogue. Human memory could not function at all if every thought, every event, every book and article was retained at the same level of focus. Our minds are constantly pruning some branches that other branches may thrive and grow. Even some trees must be lost so that others have the benefit of the light, the intellectual attention that their absence provides. However, there is also a problem with who gets to choose which branches, which trees. Gertrude Stein describes this process of curating and thereby creating a cultural composition, a meaningful pattern, and how patterns of cultural emphasis change. After the Great War, she writes, the way people saw the world changed, not because anything, quote, inside them changed, but because what they paid attention to changed. What interested people shifted, and so did their reading of the world. Figure and ground changed places. This is why the diversity of the university and similar institutions is so crucial. If the publishing house, the newspaper, and the university create and disseminate knowledge, curating, analyzing, and organizing information to transform it into conceptual patterns, then who does the curating, who does the choosing is crucial. I'll have more to say on this in a moment. As for the flood of information, was it ever thus? My mother once told me that as an 8-year-old child, she suddenly realized that she would never know every person in the world, and she cried. When I heard this story, I immediately thought, well, I could live with that. But being who I am, and not my mother, I then suddenly realized that I would never read every book in the world, and that was disturbing. As teachers age, we are often forced to abandon our illusion of control over this flow of ever-changing information. At best, we can only achieve what Robert Frost believed poetry could provide, a momentary stay against confusion. Nevertheless, those small visions of order, our syllabi, our bibliographies, our classroom conversations that rise in their own dramatic arcs to moments of understanding just before the bells ring, are consolation for the blooming, buzzing confusion outside the door. All around us, the sense of golden groves unleaving and the consequent grieving. And yet there's also a constant perpetual renewal. T.S. Eliot, in his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, writes that the great works of literature form a transcendent order that lives in a kind of eternal present. But then he immediately notes that this order keeps shifting as new works are added to the canon. They enter into dialogue with the existing tradition. But in so doing, they bring the sense of their own time with them, and so affect how we read all the others that went before them. So yes, in any given moment, the literary canon appears to have a kind of transcendent reality, but not so much if we see not only that this canon is perpetually changing, but also that powerful arbiters, such as the editors of anthologies or the designers of university courses, bring some texts back to life, allow some to wither, and ruthlessly prune others. The creation of literary canons is not transcendent, but embodies the responses of people with the privilege of making their choices matter. So just as the poet engaged in this dialogue with tradition and the present moment becomes aware, as Eliot writes, of, quote, important responsibilities, so does the teacher. How to be both an individual situated in a particular time, place, and history, yet do justice to the vision and interests of those situated very differently from oneself. The challenge is to open your attention to the broadest range of life, to expand what is interesting you, to include what is interesting others very different from you. To teach with this kind of justice in mind is to commit to an ongoing work of self-interrogation and renewal, a continual resituating of the self in relation to the world. This process demands humility concerning the limits of one's awareness, limits which will never be fully overcome, but must be challenged again and again. It demands an attitude towards knowledge that accepts its contingency and the consequent demand for improvisation, intellectual curiosity paired with flexibility and openness to change. As a result of this demand, over the 35 years I've taught American literature, my syllabi have undergone continuing revision, becoming ever more diverse, and I hope ever more engaged with our literature's multiplicity. I now teach the Lakota Sioux writer Zikala Shah in dialogue with the Nebraska Plains writer Willa Cather, Nella Larson with F. Scott Fitzgerald, Langston Hughes, and Lee Young Lee with William Carlos Williams. Including these so-called minority voices in my courses means rising to the challenges they present to the supremacy of, quote, mainstream writers, challenges that require constant revisioning of the conversations that make up the American literary tradition as we know it in our moment. Okay, so part 2. My preparing to teach this tradition is emotional as well as intellectual. For as Ralph Waldo Emerson comments in his essay, The American Scholar, instantly we know whose words are loaded with life and whose not. The poet Mary Oliver, in her memoir of her partner, the photographer Mary Malone Cook, notes, quote, "It has frequently been remarked about my own writings that I emphasize attention. This began simply enough. To see the way the flicker flies is greatly different from the way the swallow plays in the golden air. It was my pleasure to notice such things. It was a good first step. However, she says that it was observing Malone, quote, when she was taking photographs and watching her in the darkroom, and no less watching the intensity and openness with which she dealt with friends and strangers, that taught me what real attention was about. Attention without feeling, I began to learn, is only a report. An openness and empathy was necessary if attention was to matter. This insight is one that I've long taken to heart as I prepare for a class presentation that I hope will be more than just a report, perhaps even loaded with life. In retrospect, I realize that in preparing for this goal, I have a two-step process, a first and a second reading of the text. The first is what could be called a linear reading, a careful rereading of the work from start to finish, an attempt to see it freshly, no matter how many times I've read it before. I try to do this in the week or days just before class. My aim is to renew my emotional responses as well as my intellectual understanding. I mark passages in pencil that catch my attention and star those that seem especially meaningful. In a true first reading, we travel as on a road, not knowing where the text is taking us. Feelings emerge along the way, and there should be a sense of surprise when we arrive at our final destination, but also perhaps an awareness of inevitability that has been building unconsciously. A second rereading is like surveying that same terrain not from the road, but from the air. Now we can see the pattern whole and know where those twists and turns are leading. My own second readings are quick, just as skimming through the portion of the text assigned for that day, reviewing my marginal notes and refining a series of questions that I will draw on to direct discussion toward an understanding of the issues and patterns I want students to see. However, I also need that goal to remain flexible and open to what I might learn from my students in the course of that class. This piece of my preparation I try to do as close as possible to the actual class time, preferably immediately before. So if I'm not talking at lunch and I'm looking at my book, that's why. A good example of the results from this process comes from my most recent review of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Considering how many times I've taught this novel, almost every year for 35 years, you would think that it would have grown stale to me. And yet every time I read it, I find the growing friendship between the young white boy Huckleberry Finn and the escaped slave Jim immensely poignant and powerful. However, this past fall, following the events in Ferguson, Missouri, and hearing the pleas that, quote, Black Lives Matter, I found it even more so, to the point that my voice broke in front of my students when I read aloud the passage where Jim stands up to Huckleberry and, asserting his dignity, demands an apology from his young white friend for treating him like trash. Although it was not the first time this passage had moved me, in our present moment, its significance came into sharper focus and prompted a thoughtful discussion around issues of blindness, invisibility, and recognition that lasted throughout our semester. Classic literature, as Toni Morrison wrote of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, quote, heaves, manifests, and lasts. It need not be perfect, and this novel is certainly not perfect, but it needs to touch us where the most important questions in our experience lie. And as teachers, we need to share those deeper responses if we are to connect our students to what is most important, most alive about the text we teach. And now I turn to that classroom and the people who are present within it. I usually begin with a brief lecture, creating a framework for the text we're about to discuss, situating it in relation to its historical context, its critical reception, the text we have previously read, as well as providing some critical tools the class might need to talk about it. Then I ask students for their immediate responses and questions about the text, no holds barred. They can say, for example, that they don't like reading Henry James. They can't follow his sentences, and his characters are boring. And I always tell them that plenty of very smart people don't like reading Henry James, including his close friend and fellow writer, Edith Wharton. But I also tell them that they need to explain why they responded that way. Although their visceral responses are important, they need to explore and try to articulate the reasons behind them. I find that when allowed to have this first word, students often, actually always, bring up points I would have made myself. Sometimes they sound awkward and unsure, sometimes confident and articulate. The key thing is that they have ownership of those insights. My task in this phase of the class is to pick up their threads and weave them together, opening up the larger implications of what they have noticed, explaining why their perceptions are important and how they connect to central critical and scholarly issues. My aim is to give them confidence in their own ability to read and respond. The relative freshness of my own reading usually allows me to recall relevant passages rapidly so that I can make fluid connections between their insights and the issues I want to highlight. It's an improvisational process, a riffing off the comments of individual students. Here the assigned reading functions like a jazz standard in the great American songbook, the canon of American popular music, whose songs, My Funny Valentine, Caravan, Am I Blue, are endlessly open to contemporary interpretation. While T.S. Eliot identified the call and response between the poetic tradition and the individual talent, African American musicians had already discovered and refined that dynamic in the art of jazz improvisation. And like a band leader, my role is to invite participation and collaboration, to push us all toward a reading that is spontaneous and improvised, but ultimately shaped and ordered, which does not mean closed. To reach this ultimate goal, I usually shift from this improvisational phase at some point to somewhat more structured discussion, based on the questions I had prepared before class. These questions help move us through the text, producing a collaborative analysis through a series of close readings. Often I put my questions on the board and ask students to respond to them in small groups without my supervision, documenting their answers and reporting back to the class as a whole. This gives them a chance to know each other and share their ideas with peers. We then compare notes on how the different groups responded. If all goes well, it doesn't always, but if all goes well, by the end of class, a collaborative reading has emerged, coherent yet still open to differences of evaluation and interpretation. Reviewing this classroom process in light of the notion of first and second readings, I now see that students come into class with what is essentially a first reading. Their responses are often perceptive, but also inarticulate or disorganized. And since the landscape they've traveled is not yet visible to them as a whole, I try to give them that aerial view to help them see the shape, the full dramatic arc of the text, thereby bringing their own reading to fuller awareness and giving them a sense of potential mastery, perhaps even more important, of present appreciation. Fitzgerald said of his novel, The Great Gatsby, that he wanted to write something that was, quote, simple and beautiful and intricately patterned. His one-time friend, Ernest Hemingway, said he wanted to write stories that resembled icebergs, 7/8 of their meaning submerged beneath the surface. My goal is to help students see those intricate and beautiful patterns, those submerged meanings. Teaching the stories of Sarah Orne Jewett, for example, my aim is to help students attend to the silences between the characters and to sense how those silences are full of meaning, moments of unspoken empathy between people who, through dialogue, have come to trust each other. Seeing this pattern helps students appreciate what her stories show us about building a sense of community and why it matters. My aim can also be helping them to see the psychological horror at the heart of Henry James's story, The Beast in the Jungle, where dialogue fails and the silence between two characters results from a failure to see, a failure of trust and empathy with devastating consequences. That's important too. And all of this depends on getting to know my students, beginning with something as simple as learning their names in the first 2 weeks in that window of opportunity when they're still deciding whether you really have their interests in mind, and then being alert to each one's distinctiveness, the student who wants to be a poet, the student who is recovering from addiction, the one who's suffering from severe depression, and the one who's taking 5 courses while working virtually full-time, the first-generation undergraduate who dreams of earning a PhD, the evangelical Christian feeling lost in a secular school, the only African American in a class of whites, the veteran returning home from combat, the gay student who is out of the closet, the gay student who is still there. Although each one may have some aspect of difference from myself and others in the class, each one is also much more than this difference. Our identities are all complex and multiple, intersecting at some points and not at others. A literary text provides a ground for all these unique individuals to speak to each other about a common set of themes and questions, and therefore creates a structure within which we can build a community that is ideally respectful of how we were different and mindful of what we share. Okay, this third part. Turning to the writing conference and student essays, I think of Linda Lohman's anguished speech about her failing husband in Arthur Miller's play, Death of a Salesman, where she cries, "I don't say he's a great man. Willie Lohman never made a lot of money. His name was never in the papers, but he's a human being. So attention must be paid. Attention must finally be paid to such a person. Attention is precious." Andy Warhol once famously said that, quote, "In the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes. But fame, with its emphasis on spectacle or turning a celebrity into a signifier rather than a person, is not what I'm thinking of here, but rather of Marina Abramovic's moment of pure, undivided human attention. Just a few minutes of such full attention can be powerful. In my own teaching practice, this is nowhere more true than in the individual writing conference, beginning with the conference on what a student decides to write about. While I usually provide suggestions and prompts for assigned essays, some scaffolding with leading questions linked to our classroom discussions, students are often uncertain about what to write about or have trouble focusing their ideas. In that case, I invite them to meet with me one-on-one. I begin by asking, what interested you in the text you've read so far? It's very rare that a student doesn't have something that has interested them, even if they can't figure out how to turn that interest into a topic to write about. After giving them permission to explore their own responses, I work with them to build a hypothesis that grows organically out of their engagement with a particular piece of writing. Why do you think this was interesting to you? How does that connect to what we talked about in class? This is the discovery moment when we locate what James called their donné. I then explain to them how having this focus for their exploration will lead to their having a principle of selection when they reread the text and conduct research for their essay. What questions are they trying to answer? Why are they important? And I also explain to them that when they find those answers, they will have the basis for their paper's thesis, which in turn will provide the principle of selection for the details they include in their argument in support of it. And here's where James's comment that relations stop nowhere comes even more forcefully into play. Without a clear thesis statement, their argument will go wandering into fruitless and confusing digressions, losing itself in those expanses of shapeless information. And it does do that. A clear statement, however, will focus and direct the argument toward their desired goal, which is persuading the reader that their thesis is correct, and not only correct, but worth thinking about. It matters. Then there's the conference about revising a draft. In the writing conferences in the classroom, I ask the students to speak first about the text. So what do you think of your paper? If at all possible, I like them to diagnose any problem themselves, or at the very least to acknowledge that there is a problem. I want to build on their own desire for competency, their own desire to express themselves. Just as they will spontaneously identify key issues in their classroom comments about a reading, they will virtually always know when something is going wrong with their essay. If they can't nail the problem themselves, they know there is one. They know where they struggled. I got stuck and just kept repeating myself. I ended up with a conclusion that doesn't seem connected to my thesis. I just seem to be retelling the story. They may not, and often do not, know why they got stuck or confused or ended up repeating themselves. And for that reason, they don't know how to fix it. Here's where I come in as a diagnostician. I have generally found that each student's essay, even those that seem the most conventional, is a unique combination of responses, stylistic traits, patterns of insight and error. Each has a stylistic and intellectual fingerprint. As for clarity, however, all A papers are alike, and each C paper is different in its own way. The most undeveloped writer's work, if that work is a good faith effort, the paper written in bad faith is a totally different matter, is perhaps the most difficult and demanding to read. One must open oneself to its contradictions, its lapses in logic, its confused syntax, and its malapropisms. One must read around and underneath the text to what has not been said or only partially said or said in distorted and convoluted ways, to search for the core ideas and feelings that might be struggling for expression. One lends one's own mind to the student in the hope of helping them discover what it is they are trying to say, and therefore who they are. Sometimes, certainly, I may see weaknesses in a paper that a student doesn't, and then my job is trickier. I need to initiate the conversation and walk the student through the essay in hopes that they can see the problem as I see it. If so, we can fix it together. I discovered the power of this kind of attention as a student myself. In high school, I loved English and had lots to say in class. As one of the students, his hand is always up. Plenty of things teased my mind, but I couldn't manage to get my ideas put down rightly on paper. Then I spent a summer at Phillips Andover Academy, where a teacher took the time to meet with me one-on-one to talk about an essay I had written on Edward Albee's play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. He patiently went through virtually every sentence in those 4 or 5 pages, telling me what I had led him to expect at each point and where I had left him with questions unanswered or points unsupported. He made me aware that someone other than me was reading my work, an awareness that marks the transition from what composition theorists would call a writer-based essay to a dialogical, reader-based one. My words mattered to him. That meeting permanently changed the way I wrote, and it probably took 15 minutes. And sometimes I might not see something in an essay that is in fact a strength. I tell students never to be afraid to come to me to say they're disappointed with a grade, to say that they think I might have misjudged their work. After all, having just read 20 students' papers on Huckleberry Finn in a row, I might have missed something in theirs. If so, I want them to bring it to my attention, and I will be grateful, not resentful or offended. Such a meeting is a true teaching opportunity, and I tell them beforehand, I may or may not raise your grade, but I guarantee that I won't lower it, and we may both learn something. Just last year, a student wrote a paper on Howard Nemirov's The Vacuum, a short poem about a man grieving his wife's death. The poem closes with a surreal comparison of the speaker's hungry, angry heart to a vacuum cleaner howling and biting at air. I thought my students' interpretation of that final comparison was mistaken and confused, and marked her down for it. However, in conference, she argued that I was the one mistaken in seeing the image as an expression of anguish and despair, and persuaded me that it was instead an expression of the speaker's renewed appetite for life. I raised her grade and thanked her for helping me see the poem with fresh eyes. And that was not the only time that the student and teacher roles have reversed in my classroom. In fact, my most exhilarating moments as a teacher have been when students have taken an idea from me and developed it beyond what I had imagined possible, illuminating text that I thought I knew well in stunning new ways. To take just one example, there was the undergraduate interested in environmentalism and sustainability who paid attention when I commented in a rather offhand way that F. Scott Fitzgerald not only describes expensive parties of, quote, ineffable gorgeousness in The Great Gatsby, but also makes us look at the mess that's left behind and the nameless servants who must clean it up. She took this idea and ran with it, producing a remarkable eco-critical analysis that brought the novel's critique of a materialistic society's wasteful exploitation of people and natural resources into sharp focus. Her insights now shape the way I see and teach the entire book. This student and many, many others brought their own concerns to my classroom, opened new avenues of exploration, and highlighted new patterns of meaning. They took my ideas and ran with them into the future. And that, for me, is what teaching is all about. In closing, I recall Marina Abramovic lifting her hopeful face to encounter the gaze of each visitor who's seated before her. Just so, I choose to believe that every student who enters my classroom is worthy of my attention, and I try my best to make myself worthy of theirs. As for our time in history, it's true that new technologies have brought us a dramatic expansion of democratic access to information. We are in the midst of a powerful and deeply confusing moment of transition. However, I suspect that alarm at confronting all this communication is alarm in the face of mortality itself. Years ago in Burlington, Vermont, I watched monks from Tibet put the final painstaking touches on an elaborate mandala of colored sand that they had labored over for days but were now preparing in a demonstration of Buddhist detachment to sweep away. Will my own painstaking mandalas of scholarship, my own carefully designed syllabi also be swept away with time? If so, and very probably so, I think that I can face that disappearance with equanimity, not bitterness, since new patterns of meaning will grow as my students bring my ideas into the future and do with them what they will. To return to the dialogue with Tom Newkirk that prompted this talk, I have come to see that for me, teaching is, at its heart, an art whose greatest reward is the spark of connection that arcs between minds in the classroom, that ephemeral achievement of a shared vision, evanescent in the moment, but long-lived in memory, mother of all our muses. That's it.
So I'm going to say a few words, and then we're going to get some pictures here. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. I think, in fact, I'm certain I was going through. I've been here for every single one of the 25 Brierley presentations, and one of the things that struck me with your presentation, Sarah, today is how every one of them, many of others of you have been here for most of them anyway, is how the presenters reveal their own selves in their teaching through their disciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives. And I'm looking around at other Brierley recipients and how you did that in your presentation. So thank you, and thanks to all of you. So Sarah, you and I came to UNH about the same time. We actually served on a committee together in liberal arts with Dean Palmer in the early days. You don't know this, but after I first met you, I used to go over to the MUB from time to time, which you also did, and I would see you sitting at a table. She's smiling, she remembers this. She'd have a binder open, maybe it was a notebook or something, and I think you were probably reviewing, your thoughts and your notes for your course. But what I was most impressed with is how students kept coming up to you and sitting and smiling and talking with you. So that's a lot of years ago. The very first Brierley presenter was Les Fisher, also from the Department of English. And that first award was granted through then Vice President for Academic Affairs, Walter Eggers, who also then, of course, retired through the Department of English. So there's that connection, and also John Ernest, as you had mentioned. So maybe somebody out here will be here in another 25 years. We'll see. I won't be. I won't be. There's coffee and tea and water and probably some more cookies over there. We have the room until 2 o'clock. What I'm going to ask is that all of the former Brierley recipients who are here come up front, and Dave is going to take a photo of the group and maybe a few others. And I think that's all I have to say. And thank you so much to everybody, and have a great day. All right.